year ago, I got the idea to turn some old eyeshadow I didn't use anymore into watercolor paint. I started posting the videos on TikTok and they kind of went viral, and since then a lot of people have wondered how do I make paint out of eyeshadow, so I figured I would show you guys and you can make some really cool art with it. For materials, you're going to want to start with something to mix your paint on. I use this really thick glass palette I got off of Amazon. I've also used like glass picture frames before, but you want to be careful with that because one time I used it and it shattered in my hand, and let's just say that did not turn out well. You're also going to need some sort of glue tack. I just use this to hold down my palette. You're also going to need something to mix your paint with. I prefer to use palette knives. This one is my favorite. I just think it works the best. I buy these from Michael's for like $4. You don't need an expensive palette knife to do this. You can also probably just go into your kitchen and find something that looks a little similar to this and use that too. This next thing is probably the most important thing, which is a watercolor muller. This is just a really heavy object you use to help disperse the pigment within the watercolor binder. If you're bougie, you can use like a proper glass watercolor muller. This is just an espresso tapper I use, but you can also use a jar with a flat bottom and just fill it with something heavy, and that works too. The next thing you need is obvious, but it's eyeshadow. You do not need to use expensive eyeshadow for this. You can use stuff from the dollar store if I'm being honest, but you want to stay away from very glitter-based eyeshadows. Glitter and metallic-based eyeshadows are just essentially little bits of like metal or plastic. You want to stick to more pigment-based eyeshadows like this one right here, so you don't end up with very like chunky, unusable watercolor paint. And then the last thing you need is just some watercolor binder. I showed you guys how to make this in my last video. So to start off the process on how I actually make my paint, I'm going to start out by putting a little bit of glue tack on all four corners of my palette and then sticking it down to my desk. I put a piece of paper behind my palette so I can see the colors more accurately, and the glue tack just stops my palette from moving around while I mix. Next, I'm gonna choose the eyeshadow I want to turn into watercolor paint. I'm gonna be turning the shade Dungeon into watercolor paint just because it's a really pretty purple color. I essentially just dig my palette knife into the pan and crush it up. This either hurts a lot of people or people find it very, very satisfying. I kind of find it satisfying. To get the eyeshadow out of the palette, I just kind of tap it on the side of my glass palette to get all the pigment out of the pan. I then proceed to scrape it all up with my palette knife and kind of chop it into a more finer powder. You want the eyeshadow to not have big chunks in it because it will better mix with the watercolor binder. I sometimes even go in with my watercolor muller and use that to grind up the powder to an even finer consistency. This is also just very satisfying to do, so I enjoy it. After you have a more powdery eyeshadow, I'm going to scrape it up again and then we can start with the actual paint making. I start by making a little hole in the mountain of pigment I have on my palette, and then after that, I'm gonna grab my watercolor binder and start pouring it into the center. For ratios, I tend to do like 1 part watercolor binder, 1 part pigment. I got really good at eyeballing this, but you can measure it if you really want to or you're nervous. As soon as you start mixing the binder and the pigment together, you'll notice that it starts to form something that looks a lot like paint. This is probably my favorite part because you really get to see the paint come to life and you get to see the color you're creating. Once I've mixed the paint with the binder for about a minute or two, I'm gonna start mulling my paint. Mulling my paint is essentially just using a very heavy object to help disperse the pigment in the watercolor binder so you get like a smoother paint and a nicer, more professional paint. I'm sure there's someone way smarter than me on Google or YouTube that can explain it in better detail, but I just do this as a hobby because I love it. I mull my paint for about 10 minutes or until my arm starts to get sore, and then I scrape off my muller and I start to scrape off the paint that's on the palette. I'm going to be mulling this paint about 3 or 4 times just so it gets really smooth and has a really nice consistency. You'll notice the more you mull your paint, the thicker it will get and the more pigmented it will get. Right now the pigment is not evenly dispersed, there's still little chunks of pigment in the paint, so that's why you want to continuously mull it so that way it gets really smooth. When I came up with this hack, I was so excited because I really love recycling and I love taking old products and turning them into something new. So when I found out I can cut back on makeup waste and turn it into something I can use every single day, I was so happy. I've also had a lot of people send me eyeshadows from makeup creators that they don't support anymore, and I'm so happy that I can turn it into paint for them so they can use it and not feel as guilty about it. As long as it means less makeup waste and less things going in the trash, I'm happy. But I've been mulling this paint for about 20 minutes at this point, and as you can see, it's getting a lot thicker and it's getting a lot smoother, which is what you want. More high-end watercolor paints have more pigment in them and they're mulled for longer, so they sit better on the paper and they're more professional quality in terms of blending and how they look on the page. I know some watercolor companies or like homemade watercolor artists mull their paint for hours. I'm not going to do that with this paint. I find you only need to mull it for about 20 to maybe 30 minutes. Once you're done mulling your paint, you should notice that it's pretty smooth and it's about as thick as syrup. If it's too thick where it kind of feels like peanut butter, that's how you know you didn't add enough watercolor binder, and if it's too runny, that's how you know you've added too much watercolor binder. It's all about ratios. For storing the paint, I typically store it back in the original makeup palette it came in, just because an eyeshadow palette already kind of looks like a paint palette, so it works pretty well, and it cuts down on waste to buy more packaging. If you don't want to store it back in the original makeup palette though, you can use stuff like bottle caps, or you can even buy individual watercolor pans from like Amazon or any art store. After about 24 hours, your paint will go from a liquidy consistency to this to like a hard pan of watercolor paint like the ones next to it. After that, to use the paint, you just activate it with water like I'm doing here. I'm going to do a little swatch for you guys so you can see how nice the paint is. It lies on the page really super smooth and it has a beautiful color to it. Honestly, I use this paint just as much as my professional watercolor paints. I'm also going to swatch a couple other eyeshadow paints I've made. Here's a really nice like greeny blue color and a nice shimmery red color. This color has to be one of my favorites I've made so far because look at how bright and pigmented and pretty it is, and it sparkles under direct light. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope that this video inspired you to maybe pick up a new hobby in paint making and recycle some old eyeshadow. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe.